All right, hello and welcome to lesson 6.2. This is part 2 of the module 6, in which we discuss the United States Constitution. You've already talked about the 6 features of limited government in the Constitution. You will have already explored a little bit more in depth with federalism, as well as judicial review at this point. So today we're going to discuss a little bit more about checks and balances, which I think deserves its own lesson entirely because it is such a critical aspect of the Constitution and is, in fact, really the mechanism by which our system comes together. Okay, so by the end of this lesson, the student will be able to identify the basic roles and functions of the legislative, executive, and judicial branches and explain the process by which each can check the other two. A quick refresher on what is checks and balances. This is the principle that the branches are separated and that each has certain powers to check and balance the powers of the other two. This ensures that no single branch possesses all the power. Okay, and when we say check and balance, we mean one branch limiting the power of another, right? Having a mechanism by which they can limit another branch's power. Now, before we discuss the idea of checks and balances, we need a brief introduction to the basic powers of each branch. Okay, the 3 branches are, of course, legislative, executive, and judicial. When we look at legislative, first off, who or what is part of this branch? Well, this is the Congress, the United States Congress. And Congress is a general term to describe our legislature, okay, which is a group of lawmakers. And we have what we call a bicameral legislature, meaning that it's made up of 2 chambers. You have the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House of Representatives, of course, has 435 members, all of whom represent the people of this country. And then we have the Senate. There are 2 senators from each state for a total of 100 senators. And we will get into this a lot more when we discuss the legislative branch in detail later on. What can the legislative branch do? It is tasked with making and changing law, all according to the Constitution, right? Remember, the Constitution is the highest law of the land, and therefore any law that stems from it must therefore be constitutional, okay? The second branch is the executive branch. This consists of the president and their cabinet, all the advisors who handle various departments within the federal government. So, for example, the Department of Defense is headed up by the Secretary of Defense, okay, and so on and so forth. The executive branch signs legislation into law, all right? In other words, executes the law, signs it, makes it law, gives it that authority, okay? And then finally, we have the judicial branch. Okay, and this is the federal judiciary system, right? The federal court system, although we usually only refer to the United States Supreme Court, also SCOTUS. And they are tasked with studying and interpreting the law, okay? Looking at new laws, looking at old laws, determining whether they are valid, right? Do they follow the Constitution? Are they fair? Are they equitable, right? These are sort of the issues that the judicial branch deals with. Now, actual checks and balances, what does that look like? Well, to understand this, we have to look at what are some basic things that each branch can do to check the other branches, okay? Let's start with the executive branch. What can they do to the other branches that check their power? Well, the president can veto any legislation passed by Congress, which means that he or she is refusing to execute the law. This is a check on the legislative branch. Remember that Congress is the legislative branch. For the judicial branch, what can they do to them? Well, the president has the power to appoint justices and federal judges to their positions. So these are not positions that you apply for. These are positions in which you are placed. You are appointed, meaning that somebody calls you up and says, the president wants you to hold this position. Will you do so? You say yes, and then you get voted on by Congress later on, which I'll get to in a second. What can the legislative branch do? Well, their check on the executive branch, their check on the president, is that the Congress can overturn a presidential veto with a 2/3 vote in both chambers of Congress, meaning both the House and the Senate. Again, this is a check on the executive branch. What can they do to the judicial branch? Well, the members of the Senate, remember this is part of Congress, 100 members, must vote to approve of all presidential appointments to the Supreme Court. Again, this is a check on the judicial branch. What can the judicial branch do? The Supreme Court, the federal judiciary system. Well, to the legislative branch, the Supreme Court can decide that laws passed by Congress are unconstitutional, right? That's a huge check. Congress passes this law, and the Supreme Court comes along and says, no, that law is totally unconstitutional. Try again, right? Supreme Court can do that. The Supreme Court can also declare presidential actions to be unconstitutional. Again, this would be a check on the executive branch. Okay, so make sure you've written down these examples. You will definitely be tested on these. Okay, because this is fundamental to your understanding of the Constitution as a document that has specifically sought to limit the power of government, and one of those mechanisms is through the checks and balances process. All right.